Dr. Sam Vaknin on X, also narcissistic-abuse.com, as you can find out more of his research and writings. Dr. Vaknin is a physicist, I believe an astrophysicist or a cosmologist, I'm not sure which, we'll find out, who went on into psychology. And I was just telling him that some of the most interesting psychologists I know were physicists first. So please welcome Dr. Sam Vaknin.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
So I want you first to tell people about your training and your arc from physics to psychology and how these things are linked. In other words, most people think about these disciplines as unrelated, but I see the links. You tell me.
I think what I'm studying is complexity. The universe is a complex machine, if you wish, machinery. Mm-hmm. However, the human mind is far more complex than the universe. Hence my transition from one simpler machine to a more complex one, which is the human mind. And it was aided and abetted by the fact that I have been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, twice actually. And it forced me to confront my own condition and the unsavory outcomes of this condition. I delved deep into the state of the art at the time in the late 80s. I discovered there was no state and no art. There was nothing there. And so I came up with a new language to describe my inner experience and the impact that I was having on people around me. And this new language is now widely used. It's mainstream. And then I went into academia in an attempt to interact with colleagues and peers and be exposed to the latest thinking in the field. And that's how I ended up being a professor of psychology. So I think my only relative advantage is the ability to look from the inside out and from the outside in, which is denied to most of my colleagues. And so that's what I bring to the table, so to speak.
And what do you consider to be one of the most efficacious sort of management? There's sort of different words we could use, whether it's trying to help the narcissist resolve these issues or get in touch with affect or manage the condition, or other people manage the condition if they're involved with it. What do you feel is the most effective style?
It's a bleak, gloomy prognosis. What we can accomplish in therapeutic settings, in clinical settings, is behavior modification. We can minimize, ameliorate, and mitigate abrasive behaviors, antisocial behaviors, and to some extent, we can nudge the narcissist or incentivize the narcissist to conform to socially acceptable mores and norms and conventions and expectations and so on and so forth. The impact is usually short-lived, so there's a lot of maintenance to be done. Nothing fundamental can be accomplished, unfortunately. There have been a pair of recent studies published in July 2024, last year. And one study claimed that narcissists tend to develop empathy as they age, as they grow older. And the other study, which was co-authored by some of the leading voices on narcissism, Roningstam, Gunderson, others, this other study claimed that NPD can be cured. Regrettably, both studies are dramatically flawed. And I'm being charitable here, which is not not common in my case. Dramatically
not your style,
flawed.
Not with your condition.
Not my style. No, absolutely not.
And so let's back up a little bit. So we're talking about NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, but there's a reality that narcissistic traits, right? There's a point at which you cross from traits into disorder, and traits are more pertinent, more interesting to the public because we all have them, and they have predominated and become more severe, I would argue, across the 20th century. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think we should make a distinction. The first distinction we should make is between healthy narcissism and pathological narcissism. Healthy narcissism, as the name implies, is healthy. It is the cornerstone of self-confidence and self-esteem and a sense of self-worth and having a self-concept, which is realistic. So this is healthy narcissism. We all have it. We all have a narcissism trait. Traits are hereditary. They're genetically determined. So we all have narcissism that we have inherited from our parents. That has to be distinguished from what we call narcissistic style. That's a phrase coined by Len Sperry, narcissistic style. Narcissistic style is someone who is a bit obnoxious, exploitative, not too big on empathy, and so on and so forth. Someone you wouldn't want to work with or collaborate with or get married to. But that's the style. People with narcissistic style do not possess any diagnosable pathology. They are what we call subclinical. They cannot be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder because certain clinical features of narcissistic personality disorder do not make an appearance in the narcissistic style. For example, someone with a narcissistic personality disorder is unable to tell the difference between reality and fantasy, unable to distinguish external objects from internal objects. In other words, other people from the representation of these other people in the narcissist's mind. Narcissists, people with narcissistic personality disorder, are fully embedded in fantasy. They're divorced from reality. They have what we call an impaired reality testing. None of these things apply to someone who is merely possessed of a narcissistic style. So, in a way, there's a spectrum. Everyone has healthy narcissism, then some people have a narcissistic style, and some people are far gone. They have developed the clinical features, which regrettably are irreversible and cannot be kind of cured or healed.
I would argue in this country, at least I'm aware, that I think, pandemic of childhood trauma and certainly of cumulative adverse childhood experiences, however you want to frame that, has contributed to these traits in such a way that dysregulation and empathic failure in many circumstances have become the norm. And that's been a lot, even though it's not a personality disorder per se, or not even related to the traits, it's two things, plus throw in some substances, and now you really have problems. Would you agree with that? And then what does a society do that's constituted of these folks?
Studies from the 1980s onwards, especially the latest studies by Twenge and Campbell and similar scholars, have demonstrated conclusively that there is a rise in the incidence and prevalence of narcissism, the trait, narcissistic style, and even narcissistic personality disorder, especially among young people. Young people being young people under the age of 25. Later studies extended this to the age of 35. So yes, it seems that there is some kind of narcissism pandemic. I'm saying pandemic because this is not limited to the United States. There was a major scholar by the name of Theodore Millen who suggested that pathological narcissism is an American disease. He said, can't find it anywhere else. That's regrettably untrue. You can definitely find it in China.
Maybe we've exported it like we do everything else. We've infected the world like we do with everything else. But, that's far-fetched to think that. But let me stop you. I'm going to stop you. And let me stop you and say, okay, so we're now getting into the sweep of this, and I want to get into your theories about the sweep of personality across human history. And I want to tell you a quick story that I think my listeners have heard. Unfortunately, my wife has heard me say this a million times. So I worked in a psychiatric hospital from the early 80s till 2010. And when I first arrived, and I'm an internist, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I was very interested in psychiatry. I was a neurobiologist sort of by training. And so I paid attention. I watched very carefully what was going on because I wanted to learn about all this. And everybody had an admitting sheet that came in the hospital. And the way they used to construct admitting sheets was there was an axis 1, which is the acute psychiatric illness, and then axis 2, which were the personality disorders. And most people had at least trait or possible personality disorder. And some had frank disorder diagnosed. When I first got there in 1984, 85, the personality disorders were actually all over the place. They were A, B, C, the dependence, there was obsessive compulsive, there's all kinds of stuff. And towards the end of the 80s, I noticed that borderline, particularly for the females, predominated. And they all came in, I kid you not, with at least 10 lawsuits under their belt. Every single one. And then I noticed that group started moving in. They were usually very smart, and they started moving into the legal system. They became the lawyers and the judges and then the politicians. I was like, oh my God. Alongside of that, the entire spectrum of personality disorders became completely stuck in cluster B, which is sociopath, narcissist, and borderline. And primarily those that had diagnosable disorders, sociopath and borderline. And I thought, wow, I think this is the childhood trauma. Clearly I'm seeing something. And that was it. That was the end of it, and it hasn't changed since. It's actually gotten worse. So I've heard you say that really what was happening was the borderline style was taking over. And in a weird way, sociopathy is sort of borderline for the male. Speak to this. Tell me where I'm right, where I'm wrong, and I'm all ears.
Well, we use the term antisocial. Sociopaths and even psychopaths are not. Same thing. There's a huge debate, as you know, in the community. I don't want to parse those hairs out. Yeah, that's a whole another thing. Maybe one day we'll have that conversation. Yeah. I think the problem is with the DSM, actually, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's an antiquated text, much behind the cutting edge research. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example. The diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder in the latest iteration of the DSM-5, the text revision in 2022, the text has been copied verbatim from the DSM-4, a text which was written in 1998. So that's the state of the art with the DSM. That's why
are you aware of the history there, Sam? Are you aware of the history? They when they were developing the DSM-5, they wanted to do away with access to and have it all centered around narcissism. Yeah. So, and then they abandoned it and they just went back to the 90s all of a sudden. It was weird.
Yeah. Although there are traces of this debate. You have what we call the alternative model. There's in DSM, you have the alternative model of narcissistic personality disorder. But what I'm trying to say is that there's another book, and that other book is called the International Classification of Diseases. It's a diagnostic manual that is used by 80% of humanity, actually. The DSM is used only by 20% of humanity. In the International Classification of Diseases, there is no narcissistic personality disorder, or for that matter, any personality disorder. There is a single diagnosis of personality disorder, and what the ICD does, it gives you, as a clinician, it gives you a list of traits. And then it's like Lego bricks, you know? And then the ICD says, pick and choose the traits which fit your client, the presentation of a client best. Right. And then each and every client, each and every patient ends up with a highly idiosyncratic, specific profile. Not two clients end up being diagnosed with the same thing. And so if you combine, for example, dissociality, which is antisocial behavior, anankastia, which is obsessive-compulsive features, negative affectivity, the ability to experience only negative emotions, and antagonism. If you combine these four, what you end up getting is basically a narcissistic personality disorder. But it's a much more flexible system and much less counterfactual, much more attuned to reality, because people can't be divided and classified categorically. That's completely wrong. Any clinician would tell you that someone presents with narcissistic personality disorder, and 2 days later, there's a crisis and he becomes borderline. And then 3 days later, he's angry at you, he becomes a psychopath, and so on and so forth.
It's contextual, Yeah, you're sort of moving back towards psychoanalysis frame for this, but be that as it may, talk to me about the borderline trend, because that's, I heard you talking to Schellenberger about that, and that fascinates me, because if that's true, I know of no other way to deal with borderline other than containment, unless the borderline's highly motivated and wants to deal with their borderline stuff. But what is happening, and what can we do about it is really my question.
I think what's happening is we are collectivizing mental health disorders. In other words, we're transitioning from clinical entities, diagnoses, to organizing principles and hermeneutic, explanatory principles. We are organizing society, and we're making sense of society, and we're making sense of collectives, and we're making sense of professions, and we're making sense of events borrowing terms and concepts from clinical psychology. So today, if you want to explain the behavior of a certain politician, you're going to say, well, that's a narcissist. If you want to make sense of certain trends, I don't know, the war in Ukraine or whatever, Middle East or whatever, you would say, well, these leaders behave in a borderline manner. They're dysregulated emotionally and so on and so forth. So I think we are using mental health diagnosis to make sense of the world and to organize our reality in a way which would make sense. But this also has an impact on individual behavior, because the context and the narrative that governs your life, what gives meaning to your life, also dictates your behavior and also dictates how you experience yourself, your inner experience. So if the overriding narrative is borderline personality disorder, you're likely to develop borderline behaviors and you're likely to experience yourself the way a typical borderline would. And I think that's what we are doing. We are developing a borderline narcissistic and to some extent psychopathic civilization. And then individuals conform to these narratives and become these things. There's a kind of radiation, if you wish, ambient radiation. And so how to deal with this? The problem is not individual. The problem is not with individuals. It's not about containing individuals or even containing small collectives and so on. The problem is we have to redefine the civilization we live in. And regrettably, it's very difficult to do because of technology. We have created technologies that enhance and buttress these features, these pathological features in our civilization, in our contemporary civilization. So you may well get rid of some civilizational artifacts, but you will never get rid of the technology. So it's the technologies that's driving the pathologization of our civilization, of our society. And that is very difficult to do.
To dig into that a little bit, are you talking about the screens? You're talking about the phone, obviously, and the fact that there's a lack of actual human interaction or limited human interaction through the phone?
Among other things, these are the well-known grievances when it comes to modern technologies. But I think the problem is a bit more profound, a bit deeper. I think we are using technologies to signal. Most of our technologies have two features, and they're not bugs, they're features. Number one, to escape reality. These are fantasy-prone and fantasy-based technologies. They afford and they provide us with alternatives to reality. It's a rejection of reality, or what Hervey Cleckley called a rejection of life. And the second clinical feature is signaling. So there are three types of signaling, basically. There is existence signaling, like, hey, I'm here. I need to be seen. Notice me, pay attention to me, and so on. So this is existence signaling, and this is social media, for example. There is a virtue signaling, and that sits well with victimhood movements and with grievance-based discourse, and so on. So that's virtue signaling. And you have invulnerability signaling. I'm resilient, I'm strong, I'm superior, I'm a winner, I'm going to prevail. And the technologies allow us to signal in these three ways. And at the same time, all this signaling is taking place in a totally fantastic symbolic space. So we've completely divorced reality. And our civilization is responsive to these technologies. So what's happening is, because we live in a fantastic symbolic space, people with narcissism, for example, have an advantage, because narcissism is a fantasy defense. No one does fantasy better than narcissists. So they have an advantage in a fantasy-based civilization. Similarly, because a lot of this signaling has to do with victimhood and with emotional dysregulation and with aggression, externalized aggression, internalized aggression, passive aggression, and so on, it caters to the typical structure of a borderline personality, the borderline personality organization. So it's a really vicious cycle. Technology caters to these needs to pathologize civilization, And civilization is becoming more pathologized the more these technologies prevail and become more widespread.
And, I'm thinking of we started with a conversation about complex versus complicated systems, and complex systems include things like how, fireflies begin to flash together, or how birds fly in these very coordinated flocks and things. And I think you're signaling that as what the social media and the technologies are able to deliver. But I get what you're saying. I'm persuaded what you're saying is true. Once again, though, my instinct, and it's a bad one. Well, let's you play it out for me. You said it's hard to change. How do we change it? What can be done? If we can signal all this aggression and dysregulation, virtue signaling, it seems like we could signal other things as well. That was my idea about radio back in the early 90s. We could use it to do something good. I'm sure there'll be unintended consequences, but couldn't we somehow infiltrate it with something better?
There's an underlying assumption in what you're asking. And it reifies a kind of value judgment that narcissism and borderline are by definition bad or should be dispensed with. Depending on the context, narcissism could be a positive adaptation. And you mentioned leadership and so on. So perhaps if we do get to that, we can discuss this. But it could be a positive adaptation. Psychopathy as well. Yes. Borderline as well.
There's a reason these conditions, so-called, I'm using a bad word, but these constructs have been maintained through human genetic history. They have adaptive advantages in certain circumstances. But borderline is something that kind of comes on in different situations. And I've had long conversations with psychiatrists, like, why that disorder? And what the only construct I've seen people come up with is they're sort of the canary in the coal mine. They're super sensitive to things and alert the rest of us to stuff that could be dangerous. But I don't know. You tell me.
Well, certain features have been linked to creativity, for example. Hans Eysenck and others linked creativity to what they called psychoticism and neuroticism and so on. So certain features in borderline are linked to creativity. Borderline, the emotional dysregulation of borderlines could feed into certain types of arts and crafts and so on. That's one example. Nothing is bad or good in itself. I keep giving an example.
I agree. I completely agree with that. Completely. These are just names. These are just things that humans experience. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I keep giving the example. If you were, and excuse me for the perhaps politically incorrect example, but if you were an inmate in Auschwitz, and you were happy-go-lucky and cheerful and joyful and, something's wrong with you. On the other hand, if you develop depression in Auschwitz, you were mentally healthy.
You died.
It's an appropriate, healthy reaction.
But you died. Yeah. And you're more likely to die if you're depressed. That's what, I'm blanking on the author's name. It's what he observed.
But it's a healthy reaction. It's an appropriate reaction
it's a realistic reaction. Yeah.
Realistic. Yeah. I would even say appropriate. Yeah. It's appropriate to be depressed in these circumstances. So nothing is bad or good in itself. It depends on the context. I think we are living in a civilization that is irreversible. I don't believe it can be turned back. And I think since this is the case, we need to begin to adapt ourselves to narcissism, to psychopathy, and to borderline as features of our current civilization. We need to accept this.
I hear you, and I don't think that's wrong in any sense. Again, it's hard. The language gets a little murky here. We're using words like that, but I think what I would like to look for is a way to optimize the reality. Right? How do we adapt and optimize this trend? And I guess that's why I keep focusing on borderline, because excess borderline and predominance of borderline, it gets difficult to live with. It's not an optimization. So you tell me how we do that. And then we're going to have to wrap up a little bit. So go ahead, finish up here.
Everyone reacts to an incentive system. You can create an incentive system which would channel narcissism and render it productive. You can create an incentive system for borderlines. For example, borderlines react to the twin anxieties, abandonment and engulfment. If you play with these two anxieties as levers, you can utterly regulate the borderline. So we can use these twin anxieties. We can construct environments where the penalty would be abandonment and the reward would be avoidance of engulfment, for example, and thereby get the best out of the borderline. We can create an environment where the narcissist's grandiosity would be catered to, his self-concept would be upheld, and so on and so forth. And this energy would be channeled towards managing companies, I don't know, running the world, and what have you.
Yeah.
There are energies there.
Fighter pilots.
Yes, there are energies there. Studies have shown that the prevalence of psychopaths among surgeons is much higher than the general population, and among chief executive officers. Of course. Yeah. So
that's why I never think of these words as, I never think of these terms as pejorative. And yet there's an interesting phenomenon personally I have. Maybe you can give me a little insight into this. Is therapeutically, when I was tasked with helping people with these predominant traits, I did very poorly with narcissists and very well with borderlines. And it's kind of interesting. I never understood why. But we knew that, with my team I put together, everybody had their own strengths and weaknesses with different particular personality styles and whatnot. Some people even did better with the bipolar patients, whatever. My thing was, I could really help the borderlines. I could not help the narcissist. What do you think that is?
That's absolutely the fact. The prognosis for borderline is much better than the prognosis for narcissists. And the reason, I think, is that borderlines possess empathy, and they possess access to positive emotions, whereas narcissists don't. Borderlines can tell the difference between reality and fantasy, which narcissists cannot. Borderlines have a self-concept which is a bit grandiose as well, but is still geared towards external regulation, towards obtaining regulation from the outside. So it's more about health. Right. Ironically, it's about health, maintaining a healthy. So,
but it's help me if you can is their sort of position. Good luck. And then the narcissist. The only time I ever reached narcissists is when I would tell them I had trouble with that style, and they'd be shocked. They'd be like, "What? Why would you have trouble with me? I want help. What?" And years later they'd come back around. It was very interesting. But listen, I could go all day. I want to get into the weeds with you about psychopathy versus sociopathy and whatever, all these different things that the people argue about and the dark triad and things. And I hope we can get you back to talk about these things because you're.
Anytime.
I love that. I love that physicist brain working on this stuff because you're not. Even though you have a subjective experience with all this, you're not locked into that subjective experience. And that's very, very interesting to me. And we have a tendency as humans to see everything anthropomorphically in some fashion or other. I mean, when we think about aliens coming in, they always are shaped like us as opposed to who knows what, just a bacterium that inserts itself into our animal cells and creates plant cells and creates a mitochondria. I don't know. We don't think about it that way, but I do appreciate your thinking. It's been a privilege to talk to you. And I do hope you'll let me talk to you again. Where can people go to read more and learn more about your ideas?
Just Google the name. It's an avalanche.
Okay, all right, I will do so, and I'll be deeper in your material when I get back next time. So thank you so much, Professor Vaknin.
Thank you for having me. Call me Sam. Thank you.
You bet. Very interesting.